Welcome to the Man of Steele podcast. This is our very first podcast, and I never aspired to be a podcaster. However, my first guest wanted to do a podcast on Pat Buchanan and Pat Buchanan, so we're going to talk about that. So let me just kind of set the stage a little bit. We've had controversies in the last several weeks over the Heritage Foundation with Kevin Roberts, Tucker Carlson, and Nick Buchanan. And what's interesting is that most people were talking about, whether we should be platforming these people or so forth, cancel culture. But everybody seems to sort of miss the, I guess, maybe the ghost, the puppeteer that's sort of hanging over all of it. And I would love to introduce you to a professor of mine, a former professor of mine from Pepperdine School of Public Policy. It was a great program. His name is Robert Kaufman, and he was there with Bishop Davis Hanson. So you can imagine what a great program it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Professor Kaufman introduce himself, and then we'll go straight to the question.
Eli, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Professor Robert Kaufman. I'm the Robert and Catherine Doxson Chair of Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy. I am currently deployed in Washington, D.C., in our building there for two programs that the school runs and I teach in, and that's my current status. And I've written four books, and I'm in the process of writing a fifth, a biography of Joe Lieberman. And for Truth in Advertising, I will describe myself as a Ronald Reagan conservative internationalist. So that's me in a nutshell. And I'm the proud professor of Eli Steele, who I had many years ago, and I identified as an extraordinary student with great potential, and he's more than lived up to my expectations.
Thank you for that. Professor, you actually wrote a piece that came out about a month before the Heritage Foundation controversy.
Yes.
And you pretty much called out everything before it happened. And for those of you in the audience, I will put a link to the article beneath the podcast. So the first question I have for you is, what made you connect Pat Buchanan to Tucker Carlson to Kevin Roberts, who's the head of the Heritage Foundation, before the Fuentes interview blew up?
A perfect storm of bad things, and I'm not always right as a prognosticator, but I predicted the storm because what triggered my concern is one, there is a rise of anti-Semitism on the left. It dominates the Democratic Party. There is, however, disturbingly, it's still not a majority, but it is a growing faction within the MAGA movement, not the entire movement, not President Trump per se. There is also a rising tide of anti Semitism with podcaster, provocateur Tucker Carlson, the leader of the pack. And as a symptom of that rise, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, recommended in a piece in the American Conservative that President Trump give a Presidential Medal of Freedom to Pat Buchanan. Now, this is not just esoteria. This is a symptom that Ronald Reagan, the gold standard of Republican internationalism, robust American power abroad, free markets at home, individual liberty, the rejection of identity politics. Kevin Roberts is casting away that great tradition of Ronald Reagan's favorite think tank, and the philosophy of its Reaganite president for many, many years, the founding president, Ed Fulmer, in favor of a toxic Republican version of identity politics. That's not good for the party. That's not good for the country. That's not good for the world. And I warned that this mainstreaming of Carlson, who mainstreamed Fuentes, is a major watershed in the rising tide of toxic anti-Semitism that is now invading the heart and soul of the Republican Party. None other than Victor Davis Hanson published a column in the last few days warning of this phenomenon and urging us to fight it and call it out and not be silent and to fight it with no pale pastels. And I'm trying to make my small contribution because Victor said it's the obligation of all of us who know better and are concerned about the health of the Republic and the decency of it to be as vigilant as possible in our own sphere. So that's what you and I are doing this morning.
So you opened up with interesting statement that probably it did turn off most people who may be on the far right, which is you call yourself basically a Reagan conservative, and they have been trying to demonize that. They're saying that we cannot live in the past. The Reagan was, so long ago. So what do you say to those people?
Well, I say that the past they want to revive is the America of the 1930s. And the America of the 1930s, American isolationism that reached its apotheosis before World War II, is a very dangerous philosophy. And it was dangerous then, and it's dangerous applied to the world that we're in now. Aristotle, the father of political science, and people would say still the greatest political scientist, admonishes us before we talk about anything to follow his dictum that the mark of political intelligence is to make reasonable distinctions. So, not all isolationists before World War II, however wrong they were in wanting to keep out of the Second World War based on our ideals and self interest, many were honorable people who thought George Washington's tradition could apply to the conditions of the 20th century, and two world wars should have demolished that philosophy for all time. When I'm talking about Pat Buchanan and his version of America First, and his desire, and Tucker Carlson's desire, and Mr. Fuentes' desire to go back to a pre 1939 foreign policy, this is a much more sinister version of America First. Most of the America Firsters after Pearl Harbor repented. Scoop Jackson, the great coal warrior, William F. Buckley, Senator Arthur Vandenberg became staunch internationalists who recognized that the world would be nasty, solitary, brutish, and short without muscular American power. Pat Buchanan idolizes Charles Lindbergh, and the people like Tucker Carlson idolized Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh was not only notorious for his isolationism, but his anti Semitism and his demonization of those who advocated entry into World War II as un American and dangerous. Buchanan is still defending this, and Tucker Carlson has appropriated Buchanan. Buchanan defends Charles Lindbergh, who on September 3rd, 1941, gave a speech in Ames, Iowa, that almost word for word paraphrased Hitler's speech in January of 1939, where Hitler warned, if war begins. If we have a second world war, said Hitler, I don't know how it will turn out, but I guarantee one thing. The people who started it, instigated it, agitated it, the Jews, will pay the ultimate price. Lindbergh demonized those Jewish voters and pro British voters who urged us to intervene wisely as un American and dangerous. It's one thing honorably to oppose American commitments abroad, even if you're wrong. It's another thing to incorporate, emphasize, fan, and flame ancient, ugly, very, very toxic anti Semitic tropes that aren't just going to be confined to the Jews. You can make a very good case that the level of anti Semitism in a society is related to its comparative health or illness. So this isn't just a historical debate. Carlson is the most prolific platformer of all this. Let me give you a litany of what Carlson has done recently. He had on, uh, approvingly, a blogger, a fraud named Daryl Cooper, who Carlson called the greatest modern historian of our times, claim that the great Victor Davis Hanson mocked this morning. And Cooper's thesis was, hold on to your seat. Hitler wasn't responsible for World War II. It was Winston Churchill, who Ronald Reagan, American internationalist, every reputable American conservative, every person who values their freedom rightly considers the hero, not the villain of the Second World War. So Tucker Carlson is approving fawningly this Cooper fellow. And when Carlson also says, well, he's just interviewing people, let me quote Gershwin, that's not necessarily so. Contrast what Carlson did to Ted Cruz, almost mugging him aggressively during an interview, attacking everything about Cruz, denigrating Christian Zionists, who I paraphrased. Carlson said he hates more than even Netanyahu, who he demonizes. Carlson managed to be a robust, critical interviewer, and yet when he had Mr. Fuentes on, who defended Hitler, and I'm not finished, cheered for Stalin, Carlson just sat there approvingly. And Carlson has a long history. It's not just anti Semitism, it's not just Jews, it's not just Israel, it's not just Netanyahu. I became very suspicious of Carlson years ago when I watched a program of his when he was still on Fox, when Carlson had on Stephen Cohen of Princeton, who Carlson, again displaying tremendously bad judgment, hailed as the greatest history of Russia ever. In fact, he's the worst history of Russia ever. He was the greatest apologist for Russian tyranny in all its configurations in the academic world. And that's saying a lot, and none of it is good. Conversely, Carlson demonized Richard Pipes, whose family was wiped out in the Holocaust, and is by any objective measure the greatest of our Russian Soviet historians, the one who got Stalin right, the one who wrote the first draft of Ronald Reagan's seminal National Security Decision Directive 75, that was the template for winning the Cold War. Carlson demonized him. This is a problem for the soul of the United States. I paraphrase Martin Niemöller. When they came for the Jews, we did nothing. When they came, this is like cancer. You have to stop it early, decisively, with ample margins, and err on the side of not tolerating it. And right now, unfortunately, we don't have the people of stature with the same influence that William F. Buckley had during the Cold War. When anti-Semitism periodically arose during the Cold War, including Buchanan's, who used all of these terrible stereotypes to demonize Jews, blaming them wrongly for the American intervention in the first Iraq War, all the typical stereotypes. Buckley cleaned him out of the party. He did it with Joe Sobran. He did it with other people. And now is the time for Republicans, too many of whom have been silent, with the honorable exception of Ted Cruz, to stand tall and take a stand. The progressive left has done many terrible things with many terrible effects. The Democratic Party is a party so brimming with anti Semitism that they literally cost themselves a chance to win the 2024 election because of it. Now, this is chilling. Even before Mamdani, who is Hamas's favorite candidate, became mayor, and even before Barack Obama cheerfully volunteered, after congratulating this vicious anti Semite, to be Mamdani's mentor, even before that, Kamala Harris passed over Josh Shapiro for vice president in favor of Tim Walsh, who, to say the least, brought her nothing she didn't have, who performed disastrously in debate. Governor Shapiro is articulate. He was a popular governor of a pivotal state that Harris needed to win. Logically, he was the person, so why wasn't he chosen? I'll tell you why. He was a centrist, he was reasonable, he deplored the violence and anti Semitism, the reenactments of Kristallnacht on campus. Worst of all for Harris, his name was Shapiro. And that is a Democratic problem. And like a virus, it's infected us. The catalyst for the rise of anti-Semitism, there are a lot of causes in the Republican Party. 20 or 30 years of resentment of white Christian young males who are fatherless, who think that the establishment is rigged against them. But I think the wellspring of its resurgence is identity politics, remembering that the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence believed in individual rights based on what Martin Luther King famously and rightly called the content of your character. When one side marinates in identity politics, it is inevitable that sooner or later the other side is going to do it and have its own toxic version as well. So, what the progressive left has bequeathed us by rejecting the Declaration, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and those who always have reminded us in perilous times of the better angels of our nature is the way back. What identity politics has done is not only spawn fanaticism on the left, but a toxic version on the right. And for those who study history, and it's sad but true, anti Semitism, this may be a family program, but I think it's the perfect analogy. Anti Semitism seems to be sadly like herpes, it's always there. And sometimes it goes into long periods of remission. But in periods of stress, when the guardrails go down, when we forget who we are as a country and the better angels of our nature, to paraphrase Madison, it resurges in a multiplicity of forms. We've seen it virulently on the left. If you look at Pew Foundation polls, the Democratic Party, particularly young people, the party that used to be the more pro Israel party is anti Israel. And for those who say, well, anti Israel isn't the same as anti Semitism, that is theoretically true and practically, if you look at the nature of the arguments, utterly false. And we're seeing a version of this now resurge on the right. And this is why the battle for the Heritage Foundation is so significant, because Ronald Reagan was the gold standard on not only, in my view, America's role in the world. Reagan, in contrast to Buchanan, Carlson, not only grounded his philosophy in the Declaration of Independence. No American president quoted the Declaration of Independence more times in speeches than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan personally was the opposite of an anti Semite. He was a philo Semite from the beginning. Read his first memoirs. His family never tolerated anti Semitism in the 30s. His father wouldn't stay at rooming houses that restricted Jews or African Americans. Reagan went to Eureka College. His team was integrated. In the 40s in Hollywood, Reagan refused to join restricted country clubs. He joined the Jewish Club. Reagan raised money for Israel bombs in the 1940s. And there's a whole history on Reagan, but it's really summed up on page 407 and 408 of his memoirs, In American Life. Reagan says, there's no conviction I hold more deeply than the United States must defend Israel. And furthermore, as he goes on, he gives a very moving account of having friends over who denied the Holocaust. And Reagan had uh, access to the original footage of the concentration camps, given his position in the army. And when his friends said, no, it didn't happen, the Jews made it up, Reagan brought out the films. They watched it for an hour. They were all moved to tears. And that is Ronald Reagan's default instinct. And that's still the instinct of most Republicans. And one of the reasons that this battle is so significant is that uh, the Carlsons, the Buchanans, the Fuentes are trying to take over the Republican Party. They're challenging the philo-Semitism of evangelical churches. And a lot of these groypers, as they're called for themselves,
Yeah, well,
profess to be Catholic. And yet, Eli, a few weeks ago, I had the honor of being at the John Paul II Memorial Shrine at Catholic University. And the great scholar and theologian George Weigel, the official biographer of Pope John Paul II, one of the great men of the 20th century and beyond, also a philo-Semite, also the initiator of a historic reconciliation between Catholicism and Judaism. And this goes all the way back to his youth in Poland, where he was a friend of the Jewish community as well as his father. George Weigel celebrating the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, the great papal encyclical, a path-breaking step in reconciling the Catholic and Jewish communities. Weigel said this: anti-Semitism is anti-Jesus, is anti-Christian, period. So this fight for the heart and soul of the country that Kevin Roberts prefigured by welcoming back someone who should not be welcomed back as a mainstream Republican figure for the 21st century. Uh, Let me give you an analogy that we talked about before the program started. Why is Pat Buchanan, who's a significant figure now, a man of the past? What would we say if the Republican Party decided to issue a Presidential Medal of Freedom to the worst of the Confederate rebels who never repented of their rebellion. We would say that is a pretty dangerous sign, not just of their historical knowledge or their ethics, but of their political mood and the trajectory of their thought. So what Roberts did is a warning sign that what appeared to be on the fringe is like a cancer, dangerously and possibly going to break out of the capsule, to use a medical metaphor. And that's why this is not just an esoteric historical battle over Buchanan versus Reagan. Where you stand on this battle is an indication of where you stand on the United States of America. And the jury is still out on whether the natural leader of the MAGA movement, JD Vance, whether he will stand up to this, discredit this, or exploit it and be silent. And his response so far has not inspired confidence, to say the least, in every sphere that he's encountered some question of what he ought to do or say based on the rise of anti-Semitism in general and the behavior in particular of his good friend Tucker Carlson, whose son is a speechwriter for JD Vance. Let me just give me one disturbing factoid. When Carlson had on this blogger, Daryl Cooper, this fraud, whitewashing Hitler, slandering Churchill, soiling the historical record, reporters asked Vance, are you going to dissociate or chide or criticize Carlson? And Vance said no. And so far, Vance has said he doesn't want to involve himself in these intra-party squabbles. He wants to focus on the Democrats. That's an evasion. I agree with Ted Cruz, who has been the most heroic and outspoken on this. This is the time to take a stand. This is not the time to be silent. To be silent is to commit the sin of silence when silence is extremely dangerous.
Reagan is not a person of the past. He's not somebody who should be dismissed as a person of the past. Rather, I think the way to look at him is that he is the carrier of the American creed. He is the one that carried through his time. And the question is, do we continue to carry that on? And there's one huge problem that I'm seeing here, which I think you've kind of covered in your anti-Semitism. And you also mentioned identity politics. In a way, you can have what the left did for years, which is practice relentless identity politics, where you make the identity of immutable characteristics the most important thing, where you organize the morality around that. And as you said, there could be a reaction to that. And Buchanan probably was the one that started early. My father started that. You can't punish white people for the sins of the past. You can't do that. But my father, Shelby Steele, what makes him different than Buchanan was that he said the way out of this identity politics was the American way, to become an American. And instead, he seems to go more towards white identity politics. And so that's what we find at the crux of today. So when you have the heritage fallout, you're having a fallout over white identity politics.
You're absolutely right. What Buchanan and I'm sorry to say, and much of the rhetoric of J.D. Vance is calling for, what Carlson is calling for, is mischaracterizing us as a white Christian nation based on nationalism rather than a creed. If you go back to Ronald Reagan, and you can see him on Reels, on Facebook, and many other places, one of Reagan's favorite quotes was, This is the only place in the universe where you can be an American, just like anybody else, with full rights and privileges, and contribute to this wonderful social experiment by accepting a simple creed. We don't ask you where you're from as long as you're legal. All we ask you to do is embrace the creed embodied in the Declaration of Independence, that we are endowed, all of us, individuals, not just white males, not just Christians, not transgender, we as individuals, not groups, endowed with inalienable rights, endowed by our Creator. They're not man made. We're obligated to respect those inalienable rights in every single person, regardless of race, creed, and color. And our greatest statesman, including Reagan, but in a long line beginning with George Washington, with a stop at Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, that has always been the gravitational lifeline to save us and to shame us into repenting in those periods when we have not lived up to the angels of our nature. Or as I put it,
let me read the quote. Let me read the quote from Buchanan. Buchanan said, quote, I am not a racist. The culture that built America was European, Christian, and white. To preserve it, you must preserve the people who created it.
well, first of all, historically, Buchanan is wrong, although Washington, George Washington, if you read his farewell address, considered Christianity foundational to the moral cultural system, and he's right. He also included Judaism very early on in his famous noble letter to the Touro synagogue that welcomed Jews to America, not merely tolerating them, but considering an intimate, integral part of the experience. John Adams said much the same thing. And if you read Os Guinness, who is a wonderful Christian scholar's marvelous book on what the American founding owed to Judaism and the Old Testament, A, Buchanan is wrong historically, and B, Buchanan's nativism ignores his own history. If you really want to be finicky about it and root this in nationalism and religion, we are an Anglo-Protestant nation predominantly. Well, Buchanan's ancestry is, I think, predominantly German, and he's Irish Catholic, and he's German Catholic. If somebody were writing a book in the 1840s when Buchanan's relatives came to the United States, look at the history of the Know Nothing Party that Lincoln also resisted. Buchanan would have been the type of people that a Buchanan of old would say can't become American because it's blood and soil rather than a creed. Understand that the Anglo American notion of liberty, rooting rights in individuals, is fragile and noble. And look at the alternatives when we make rights tribal. It is the Autobahn to rivalry, blood, soil, and iron. Why would we want to cast away this wonderful experiment, which has brought out usually the best in all people who have come legally? They've done better here than at home. Why would we cast that away for a tribalism that has produced much woe and suffering and discord? What would have happened in the Second World War if the Germans had gotten the bomb first, the atomic bomb? You know why one of the reasons the Germans didn't get it? Because they thought like Buchanan. They didn't want certain types of people. Because if you look at the 12 principal scientists involved in the atomic bomb, 11 of them was called the Jewish bomb. 11 Jews, and Enrico Fermi, the 12th, was married to a Jewish wife and left Italy before Mussolini rounded them up. If you look at overall how legal immigration, people who want to be American, people who want to accept the very creed that Buchanan and Carlson and Fuentes want to cast away. These are the people that have accounted for the United States not just becoming great, but having the dynamism to remain great because we attract the best who want to be here for the right reasons. And that's not creedal. That's the Declaration of Independence. And again, I'm all with people about the importance of culture. It's important. I'm all for people who say, when you come here, you have to accept the American creed. I'm all for considering multiculturalism pernicious, but again, making reasonable distinctions. This idea of resorting to nativism and excluding people as the other is not only immoral, it's also practically dangerous, and it will hurt the country practically, not just morally, although both are significant.
So yeah, you mentioned Skinner, and I'm gonna read a quote for you that I have a question. He wrote, quote, "The Constitution is somewhat nationalized. It's the most secular form of the Jewish continent. And, quote, is freedom within the continent. Freedom requires truth. Freedom requires character. Freedom requires a way of life, knowing how we live together freely. That's the biblical way. Order, freedom. That's the genius of America."
I couldn't have put it better. And just to remind your readers, that's the great Os Guinness. And just to remind your readers that this is a very well informed, very distinguished historian, very conversant theologically, Christian historian, paying homage as our founding fathers did from Washington to Adams to Alexander Hamilton, who were much more literate than Buchanan, Carlson, and Fuentes. To be fair, Buchanan is a serious thinker. I think a warped one, but a serious one. As Sebastian Gorka put it, Carlson is just a cheap version of Buchanan, an inferior version, um, and Fuentes is literally incoherent, but dangerous, not because of his persuasiveness, but by the forces he represents as a symptom of a disease.
What's interesting about that quote is that it talks a lot about freedom. And freedom, as we know, as my father would say, is a condition. It's not a promised land. It's not a guarantee of anything. It's just a condition. Here are the laws. You are free to do whatever you want within this, as long as you obey the laws. Disobey, you go to jail. You have the American dream. And so what's happening right now is Buchanan, all the others have been doing a lot of maybe what we would call glorified complaining. They've been complaining about everything. They've been complaining about the way the world is. And one of their complaints is, hey, we have followed the path of Ronald Reagan. We have followed the path of the content of our character. Look where we are. Everybody's tribal. White people are not allowed to be tribal. So you guys have failed. It's time for us to become tribal. That's the way forward.
Yeah,
What do you say?
well, I would say they are the equivalent of the physician who have diagnosed the symptoms of the disease, misunderstood the cause of the disease, and therefore their remedy is actually replicating the mistake that caused the disease in the first place. Yes, it is very distressing, as many scholars have written, that identity politics menaces this great social experiment. But what's the remedy for that? More of it? Or is the remedy to repudiate it and to recover our first principles? Reagan constantly warned, despite his optimism, every generation in America is going to have to fight for its freedom. And he went on to say, again, famously, repeatedly, that you can lose your freedom in a generation if you forget how you got it and what made us great in the first place. And what made Reagan so great and so timely is that in the late 70s, America, like this moment, was a very pessimistic place. Nixon and Kissinger thought that the Soviet Union was on the rise and we had to make the best deal possible. Jimmy Carter, his infamous malaise speech, that debacle in the desert, the rescue mission that didn't even get off the ground. The 70s seemed to symbolize that we were in the age of limits. And that was the expert opinion of both parties. And along comes a guy who just says no, who says our best days are ahead of us if we remember how we became great in the first place. Free markets, individual rights, a Judeo-Christian moral system welcoming to all people compatible with those ethics, strong national defense, championing American exceptionalism, and understanding that American power is not something to be worried about. We should be worried when we don't have it and the will to use it. And Reagan said that's what made America great. And that is what made the 80s a decade of rejuvenation after the malaise of the decade of the 70s, when we forgot those lessons and thought that our better days were behind us. And so I'm going to quote to you Charles Crowther: decline is a choice. It's not inevitable. It depends on what we do and don't do. And Eli, that's very biblical. Why did God give us free will? Because he loved us enough that he wanted to give us a choice and make us responsible for our own destiny. That is America in a nutshell, and any rejection of that fundamental truth encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence risks the vitality of the greatest social experiment the world has ever known. Are Americans perfect? No. Are we flawed? Yes. Are we going to discover a utopia within history? No. Will the attempt to do that bring hell on earth? Yes. But the problem has never been our principles. It's been living up to them. I mean, think about it. The remedy for Germany wasn't to be a better Nazi, or the Soviet Union or Maoist to be a better Stalinist or Maoist. In the United States, yes, we had slavery, which was a deviation from a principle. It has been our principles that have been the lifeline, the gravitational pull to reel us back when our flawed human nature has us being less than we should be.
Absolutely. That's why tribalism is anti-American. If you are tribal, you are anti-individual. And the only reason for these ditches of the country is individualism. That's it. I mean, you should be
Yeah,
your own person.
Eli, I think that's very perceptive, and ironically, for the people on the right like Buchanan and Carlson and Fuentes and the nativists, they're the ones who are anti-American. They're the ones who are rejecting the underlying premise of the American social experiment. They are the ones who want some version of German blood and soil nationalism rather than adherence to a creed. And so I'm going to do some jujitsu on them. They're the ones who have problems with what America is about, not me, and not those who defend the honorable tradition that George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and Ronald Reagan exemplified at our best. And Ted Cruz is warning us that anti-Semitism of the nature we are encountering it, certainly on the left, but even on the right, is a dangerous symptom that all is not well in American body politic. It's time to go to the doctor and fight it.
I have two more questions.
Okay?
One would be Reagan at a history show was one of the greatest fighters for freedom in America. Can you talk about what Reagan did against communism versus Pat Buchanan isolationism? What would America have been like if Pat Buchanan had been the president in the 80s?
Well, let's do a thought experiment. Buchanan wrote preposterously a revisionism of Reagan that wasn't really Reagan, that unlike the neocons and the hawks of the 90s, Reagan didn't emphasize military force. It's nonsense. It was the Reagan military buildup by all reputable accounts of what brought the Soviet Union to the point they had to take a gamble on Gorbachev. And what got Gorbachev eventually to surrender? It was a relentless American pressure. Reagan wasn't silent on freedom. His first press conference, compare it to Carter, where Carter went to Notre Dame on March 15th, 1977, and said, we had to overcome our inordinate fear of communism. Nonsense, countered Reagan. First press conference. Soviet Union is an evil empire that will lie, cheat, and steal to achieve its ultimate objectives of world domination. Instead of pessimism, America in decline, it's hopeless, there's no way out of it, the energy crisis. Reagan unleashed the market. Reagan at the British Parliament in 1982, smart people thought he was deranged, said, communism is a sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose final pages are now being written. He's right. But Reagan didn't confine himself to words. He's not Barack Obama, talking big like a twig. His deeds matched his words. Not only the massive military buildup, not only the restoration of America's economy rooted in private enterprise, not just restoring our moral self-confidence. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. But also the technological revolution he ushered. It's not just that we outbuilt the Soviet Union, we brought the arms race because of our dynamism that Reagan unleashed in an area where the Soviet Union couldn't compete. If we're going to overcome the Chinese threat, which is not just geopolitical, but economic, political, military, and moral, this is an ideological struggle. We're going to need to unleash all of those creative forces that Reagan unleashed to overcome the most dangerous peer competitor we've ever had. Imagine the left and the right gets its way. The United States either disappears, retreats from the world, the left because we corrupt the world, the right, we're too good for the world. Well, what you say, we disappear. And go around the world and see what the world would be like without the United States. Indo-Pacific, who would dominate it? China. What's China like right now if we're knowledgeable? It is one of the most repressive, brutal regimes on the planet. Are you going to leave the world up to the Putins, the Xi Jinpings, the militant mullahs? And you think the United States can be safe in such a world where most of the world's resources are outside the Western Hemisphere and we're a hostile, malignant entity to dominate it? We would become a garrison state and eventually lose. Nicholas Speakman, American Power, World Politics, this emphasis on hemispheric defense alone, been there, tried that, doesn't work. You're much better off fighting them there or deterring fighting in the first place by having credible forward positions in free countries like Japan and the European continent, the Western members of NATO and Britain. than you are reacting. Because, Eli, for all the mistakes we made before World War II in being isolationist, A, it was a close run thing, misreading Hitler. B, we were unprepared. And C, we were lucky that the technological environment permitted us, despite the enormous cost, to retake Western Europe. There's not going to be D-days in a world of drones and precision missiles. Once we're driven from these places or leave volitionally or a combination of both, that's it. If we believe in health insurance and car insurance, we ought to believe in freedom insurance. And that doesn't mean every intervention is right. There are legitimate disagreements about particular interventions. And criticism is absolutely necessary as a corrective mechanism because we all make mistakes. And one of the virtues of our system is to learn from those mistakes. And those who are internationalists are not immune from mistakes, nor is anybody else. But that's different than throwing the baby out with bathwater. And what the critics are doing on the left and the right and maligning those who think it's dangerous, they're not just saying that they disagree with the internationalists, they're demonizing them. And that is reactive devaluation, which is dangerous intellectually, morally, and geopolitically.
People will say, okay, well, for me, the interesting thing is that on the right, we come into power. We've had Trump. We have the greatest opportunities to take down tribalism that has been on the left. And what do we do at that point? Pick up tribalism. And I think that's very interesting because we do that at a time when America is the most privileged, is the most wealthy. We do have problems. We have the debt and so forth, but we have a standard of living that has probably never been achieved in the entire humanity. So my last question to you is tribalism the new big fight that we have today thought of as communism was, because the tribalism is tied to Marxism, is tied to all of this bullshit. Liberation ideology, all of it, ethnic study, everything. Is that the big fight of today, or is it something else?
No, it's a fight for today. And let me close by saying that President Trump, as is his position of being unique, is a paradox. In many ways, President Trump has been, for all of his crooked timber, absolutely instrumental in the education and culture field in restoring us to our original, more noble understanding of individual rights and a meritocratic society. Think of his long overdue, absolutely justified assault on the entire idea of DEI, which is a euphemism for quota, anti-merit, and tribalism. And let me close with a sort of a question that's a rhetorical one. Wouldn't it be tragic that the Trump presidency would end up being remembered as making so much progress on the domestic front while snatching defeat from the jaws of victory by descending into a toxic anti-Semitism and isolationism that squanders his very noble achievement in restoring American educational life to merit? And so for President Trump, don't you want to be remembered, sort of a movie metaphor, as the man who shot Liberty Valance twice, not only domestically, but fought off those demons in his own party who threatened what he has so successfully done in other spheres. So I'm appealing to the better angels of President Trump's nature, and I hope President Vance, Vice President Vance, has them, although I'm more confident right now by far in President Trump's basic instincts. Let me just conclude one thing. And here's another paradox that there is anti-Semitism rising on the right. Donald Trump is not an anti Semite. You can make a very good case personally, his grandchildren, his policies, uh, authorizing, and for our own interest, not Israel's, bombing the Iranian nuclear facilities. You could make a very good case that Donald Trump, objectively, even if liberal Jews are ungrateful, has been the best friend that the Jewish community has had since Moses. And unlike American liberals, Israelis know it. So this is not a Donald Trump problem, but is a problem in precincts of Donald Trump's coalition.
Professor Kaufman, thank you very much for this.
Eli, thank you for the opportunity. As you know, I would speak to you anytime. And in days that I'm depressed, being a professor, why does it matter? I'm looking at you, your success, and you vindicate the career I chose. So it's an honor to be on your program.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll do this again for sure. We'll do this again.
Great. Thanks again.